Since the huge drop of Sumeru, a ton of characters have received a bunch of changes to their best teams, and Kokomi is no stranger. As of her second rerun, she now has access to so many great new teams and synergies, and so I wanted to remake a portion of a guide I made a long time ago. These are some of Kokomi's best teams in different playstyles. The very first team we're going to be talking about today is the Fridge Comp, which often features Kokomi, a Cryo, a Dendro, and a Flex. For this team, I'm actually running Kokomi, Rosaria, Dendro MC, and Kaya, and the main reason being that these two cryo damage dealers will help output a lot of damage. However, this is a very flexible team. You can go ahead and replace the cryo units with someone else, like if you wanted to use Ganyu instead or Ayaka, that could also work out pretty well. You can also opt for an Animo grouping character, and this can actually be very effective because it'll pull all of the blooms and enemies together. For example, if you use someone like Venti, you'll be getting a ton of damage from Venti, but you'll also be bringing all the blooms and enemies together to deal tons of AoE damage. Now, the concept behind this team is actually pretty dang simple. I've explained this concept in a few different videos of mine, but to put it simply, whenever you apply an element to a character or enemy that has another element on them that already has another aura, the new element that you're applying has to get through a certain amount of aura in order to become the next aura that the enemy has, or to get rid of the aura completely. So what this means for enemies that are frozen is that if you apply Hydro to them and they have Dendro as well as freeze on them, you'll actually get more Dendro out of the frozen enemy because you're not going to be hitting the Dendro with as much Hydro, and therefore making the Dendro last longer. That effectively means that you're going to be getting more bloom reactions for the same amount of Dendro application, and that's what makes Fridge strong. Now, the reason this team is so good for Kokomi is because her Hydro uptime is incredibly good. Kokomi's Jellyfish deals Hydro damage and applies Hydro every single time it ticks, and if you combine that with Kokomi's normal attacks and charge attacks, whichever ones you prefer to use at the time, you're basically applying a ton of Hydro to frozen enemies that have Dendro on them and effectively creating a bunch of blooms. Once there are 5 Dendro cores on the ground, if you create another Dendro core, that will forcefully blow up the first one to have been made of the 5. So you can effectively force explode the blooms as well, and it just adds up to a ton of damage. Against frozen enemies that have Dendro on them, Kokomi is going to take ownership of every single one of those blooms, assuming you have the right rotation, or there's not certain enemies that get hit by Dendro later, and that will effectively allow Kokomi to be dealing most of the damage with her Elemental Mastery build, which is what you're going to want to build on her. I like to opt for the full Gilded Dream set, the one that gives you a bunch more Elemental Mastery, but you can honestly just use whatever sets you want that have Elemental Mastery on them. The most important thing is that you have triple Elemental Mastery Sands, EM Goblet, and EM Circlet. If you don't have a character on the Dendro Reaction set, the one that makes it so that enemy Dendro resistance gets lowered, you can also use that on Kokomi, but typically I like to put that on the Dendro character, which is Dendro MC in this case. Overall, Fridge is an incredibly powerful team, and it's just a lot of fun to see all of the Dendro cores stack up and just blow up for massive damage, and the idea of Kokomi being on field for a lot of the time is just really fun to me. It's a super neat variant of Freeze, and I highly recommend trying it if you have Kokomi. Just one thing to know is that if you're trying to optimize a Fridge build, Aito is technically going to be better here just because he deals a lot more damage, so just keep that in mind. If you're more in it for the team type itself, Aito will be better, but if you're just trying to play Kokomi, this is a really fun way to do it. The next team for Kokomi that we're going to be talking about today is one that you've probably already heard of plenty of times from this channel, but if you haven't, well, I hope you learned something new. This is going to be the Kokomi Taser team, which is going to allow you to play Kokomi on field while still outputting tons of damage just due to the team comp being so perfect. Typically, this team features Kokomi, Fischl, Sucrose, and an Electro or Hydro Flex, with most people opting for Beto in the 4th slot, but you can technically go ahead and slot Xingqiu or Yelan in that slot as well, just depending on who you prefer to run or what the Abyss calls for. If you opt for double Hydro with Xingqiu or Yelan and Kokomi, you'll have a ton more single target damage, and you'll have a bit of an easier time getting Kokomi's burst back. But if you opt for Beto, you'll clear a lot of floors that have a lot more enemies on them much easier, just due to how Beto deals a ton of area damage. Now, if you didn't know this about Taser, usually Sucrose is the one driving Taser. Typically speaking, Sucrose is on field and swirling around Hydro and Electro, and when you swirl an element, all it does is spread that element jumped around a little bit. So technically speaking, Sucrose is applying Hydro and Electro, while Beta Official and Synchro are also applying Hydro and Electro, which essentially just activates a ton of Electro Charge and Swirl damage and creates an absolutely insane team that deals so much damage over an area. Now, Kokomi's personal Hydro damage is pretty solid. It's not on the level of most hyper carries, but when you add it into something like Taser, you can actually deal some pretty solid damage. On top of that, when you're running Kokomi Taser, you can actually run her with the 4-piece Clam set, which is essentially going to deal some physical damage in a small area while Kokomi is healing your team. So your team's damage output will be increased by that as well. You can opt for 4-piece Tenacity on Kokomi here, or 4-piece of the Hydro set. There's lots of different ways you can run this, but the main thing is that you just want to make sure that you focus on HP on the Sands, Hydro damage on the Goblet, and healing bonus on the Circlet. That's going to net you the most personal damage for Kokomi. Now, one other thing to consider is that you will get a little bit of help with battery from Fischl, so you don't need to run double Hydro, but double Hydro can make this team a lot easier to run for Kokomi uptime. It's also worth mentioning that you can actually get more damage out of this team with someone like Kazuha. Since Sucrose isn't going to be actively on field, Kazuha can help buff your Electro and Hydro damage, and you can also use Favonia's Sword, which will help battery your Kokomi as well. So that's going to be one option you have, and another option that you have is to fit in Yai Miko for Fischl or for Beta, whichever slot you prefer if you just want to play Miko. Unfortunately, Kuki and Dory's damage here aren't super great. You could add them in, but Kokomi's already a healer, so you don't really need Dory for that, and you'd just much rather have Fischl. All in all, this team is super powerful. It works in almost every single abyss, and I definitely recommend giving it a try if you want to play Kokomi on field. Now, the third team we're going to be talking about is actually a physical damage team that features Kokomi as both a support and an extra damage dealer. What I mean by this is that she's going to be using the Ocean Hued Clam set, which is going to deal physical damage based on the amount that she heals. In a physical damage team where you have Superconduct going off, which is a combination of Cryo and Electro, enemies' physical resistance is going to be lowered, which is going to allow the Clam set to deal even higher damage. So for this team, I like to go with someone like Eula, Kokomi, Fischl, and Rosaria, with Fischl there to help with the Electro part of the Superconduct and solid uptime, while Rosaria is also adding extra cryo damage, and at Constellation 6 she's able to lower physical resistance of enemies even further. On top of that, Eula also has some debuffs in her kit. Shatter damage is also pretty cope, but you can also get some shatters off, which will help deal a little bit more physical damage. You should never build for shatter damage as of right now in patch 3.0, but it's a little bit extra to look forward to. Now, the one downside to this team is that team synergies are very, very limited. There's only a few characters you can use in this team that are actually going to make it work at a high level. The main two characters you would be thinking about are Eula and Razor. There are other physical carries in the game, but Eula is a very solid character for lowering enemy resistances, and she's cryo, which helps with the Superconduct. If you wanted to use someone like Zhongli, he would not be able to Superconduct personally. You would have to use a different character. So for this, I recommend Eula or Razor specifically, but with that said, it can work with other characters. Whatever you do, just make sure that your supports are built well, because supports do carry the damage dealers in this game. Putting Rosaria on something like 4-piece Noblesse, or even potentially putting Fischl on something like 4-piece Tenacity, can be very helpful for your team's total damage output. And for Kokomi, since she's going to be off-field most of the time in this build, I personally recommend using the Clam set with HP healing bonus, but some people will opt for Hydro damage on the Goblet, and that's totally fine. If you go with the double HP, you'll get a little bit more Clam damage, but if you go with the Hydro damage one, you'll get a little bit more Kokomi personal damage. So it's all up to you and what artifacts you have. But personally, for this build specifically, I recommend double HP with the healing bonus Circlet, just because she's not going to be on the field that much. All in all, this team is pretty good for all of the synergies it brings together and allowing Clam to deal more damage just based on Kokomi's healing. And if you're a Eula main and you have Kokomi, I'd highly recommend giving this one a try. Now, the fourth and final team that I want to talk about is going to be a freeze team. Now, this is going to feature a cryo damage dealer, Kokomi, an Anemo character, and then likely another cryo damage dealer, but the spot is sort of flexible. The premier team would be Morgana with Ganyu, Mona, Diona, and Venti, or you could replace Ganyu with Ayaka, but Kokomi actually has better Hydro uptime for freeze teams than Mona does, so you can actually replace Mona with Kokomi even if you lose out on Mona's damage bonus. Since Kokomi also heals, you can replace Diona Iona with another damage dealer, which should more than compensate for Mona's damage bonus unless your speedrunning clears in about less than 10 seconds or so. I personally opt for Rosaria for the second cryo and Venti for the Anemo, but realistically you can use any cryo damage dealer that has off-field cryo, and any Anemo character should work, though Venti, Kazuha, and Sucrose will be the best ones. Freeze is pretty straightforward. You just want to make sure that you put Kokomi's jellyfish out to keep enemies frozen in place, and then you can group them with your Anemo character and deal tons of damage with your cryo damage dealers. Kaya, Rosaria, Ayaka, Ganyu, and even Shenhe are all capable of dealing pretty solid cryo damage, and so when you happen to get them all grouped up in one spot, you'll deal tons of damage to all of the enemies at once. Meanwhile, they are not fighting back at all, so your job is just very, very easy. Now with Kokomi in this team, I actually like to opt for the 4-piece tenacity set. This is going to give her a small HP bonus, and every time her elemental skill ticks and hits an opponent, your team is going to have a refreshing 30% shield strength, which isn't relevant in the team that I suggested, but if you use Iona, that could be relevant. But it's also going to give you a 20% attack buff to all of your nearby characters. Now this is going to be huge because most cryo damage dealers actually snapshot buffs. You can go ahead and snapshot that attack buff onto Ganyu's burst, you can snapshot it onto Rosaria's burst, and in general you can just increase your damage output overall. On top of that, you can run something like Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, which I've been running on Kokomi in almost every build today, because you can pass an attack buff to another cryo character and they can maintain that attack buff for a really long time. Overall, I personally find a lot more comfort with Kokomi than Mona in a lot of the freeze teams that I play, and if you haven't tried Kokomi instead of Mona in your freeze team yet, I highly recommend it. Kokomi is an extremely versatile unit, and we've just found more and more ways to use her over time. With one of the most flexible kits and prettiest designs in the entire game, there's no reason to not really want to play her. So I hope this video helped you find a team that you enjoy playing Kokomi on. With all that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. As always, make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Leave a comment if this helped you, or tell me what team you're playing. I go live on Twitch a few days a week at twitch.tv/Braxophone, where you guys can come and either ask questions, hang out, or just spam emotes. I don't know. Anyways, catch you guys next time.